What is Anarcho-Communism, and how does it contrast with Anarcho-Capitalism? Anarcho-Communism is a theory of anarchism which advocates the abolition of the state, private property, and capitalism in favor of common ownership of the means of production, direct democracy, or a horizontal network of voluntary associations and workers' councils with production and consumption based on the guiding principle, from each according to his ability to each according to his need. Which brings us to our first contradiction. Anarcho-communism is basically a voluntary government. Although anarcho-communists call for abolishing the state due to its coercive nature, they still want to keep a system that central plans. One of the largest proponents of anarcho-communism, Peter Kropotkin, argued against capitalism. This is because Kropotkin had a difficult time differentiating between capitalism and corporatism. Capitalism being defined as the lack of a public sector, and corporatism being defined as statist advantages, loopholes, lobbying, subsidies, protectionism, barriers to entry against competitors, basically any state-backed intervention that is economically advantageous for the corporate structure. This same corporate structure that is, of course, created, licensed, protected, and backed by the state in the first place. They fail to realize that free market businesses are viewed in the same light as an individual's home. Unlike businesses in statism that are really controlled by the centralized coercive monopoly through various regulations, and which could be confiscated legally through political whim. They also fail to realize that property rights are a natural occurrence of spontaneous order. That if the state's monopoly on justice was abolished, and dispute resolution organizations or tiered arbitration, whatever you want to call these competing law firms, if these DROs were allowed to operate outside the government's monopoly, that they would have a direct incentive to protect private property rights. In fact, that is what every consumer is actually purchasing from them. Protection over property, both over oneself, self-ownership, and justly acquired property. Let's look at the term private property for a second. Private property is the right of persons and firms, voluntary groups of persons, to obtain, own, control, employ, dispose of, and bequeath land, capital, and other forms of property. Private property is distinguished from public property, which refers to assets owned by a state, community, or government, rather than by individuals or a business entity. Private property emerged as a dominant form of property in the means of production and land during the Industrial Revolution in the early 18th century, displacing feudal property and guilds. Private property rights are the backbone of individual rights. They're simply an extension of the right to own yourself, self-ownership. The lack of private property rights leads to collective ownership. This means that in anarcho-communism, the system would have the right to vote away your property. If someone walked on your land, you would have no rightful means of removing them from your justly acquired property. What incentive is there for you to maintain, let alone improve the property, if it is always under the threat of siege? Unlike anarcho-communists, anarcho-capitalists view this intruder's actions as trespassing, a form of theft, as long as the property owner justly acquired the property through the peaceful and voluntary market. In other words, a mutual agreement from the previous rightful owner. Anarcho-communists also ignore scarcity, often referring to the post-scarcity period or era in which they have the means to satisfy all wants and needs, which is simply not true. They also ignore spontaneous order and the individual rights that would be inherent without institutionalized violence, without the state, instead choosing collective central planning, which often always whittles down to an oligarchy. The kicker? You can have anarcho-communism inside anarcho-capitalism, but you can't have anarcho-capitalism inside anarcho-communism. If the central directive views your land as valuable, and since they have no concept for the respect of justly acquired property, your property would be seized in a matter of seconds. After all, the system's property rights come before yours. Although that brings us to another contradiction, since no one is supposed to have property rights at all. In anarcho-capitalism, individuals could voluntarily create and form a collective and run it as they see fit. Anarcho-capitalists are not allotted the same respect. Most anarcho-communists are not anarcho-capitalists because they look down on private property. Anarcho-communists have an inherent belief that property rights only come from the state. They don't realize that the state has always been the greatest opponent of property rights, not a defender. They usually view the profit incentive system as inadequate and damaging, which I don't know what they want, losses? No, but seriously, they are central planners. They want to collectively own and plan their entire economy, but without a feedback mechanism. Voting every so often is obviously not as reliable as tracking medium of exchanges, money, through the pricing mechanism where individuals put their money where their mouth is. The nice thing about anarcho-communism is supposedly all of this is supposed to be voluntary. But this is simply what a business is. They simply use the pricing mechanism to measure feedback and adjust investment or withdraw investment based on these indicators. The problem is the state's intervention, its taxation theft, its destructive and politically tainted regulation that is often prescribed by the statists, corporatist lobbyists themselves. This is what rules society today. We are trapped to statism, to institutionalized coercion, and it's not voluntary. It is enslavement. Once you get rid of the collective's system of institutionalized violence, the monopoly control of fiat currency would vanish. The large-scale wars would be impossible, as the statist systems and their military-industrial complexes would not be able to dump the costs, not only on future generations through debt, but also through taxes and inflation in the present. No one would fuel victimless crimes, as it is a losing battle, and almost no one would write a check out of their own checkbook for thousands and thousands of dollars for impossible results. The problem is, instead of admitting the truth that central planning, especially without a money system, let alone individual rights, property rights, is an ultimate failure. They create a new voluntary government which only leads to control and protection over the collective's assets. How can this collective claim to have property rights when it won't even honor the individual choices of those inside its system? What if a person doesn't want to give up the land that they put time and sweat and labor into, the land they raised their kids on? What if this family disagrees with the collective? Obviously, the collective has gotten it wrong numerous times. Even voluntary central planning is a failure and inefficient, and it only opens the valve to coercive central planning. The free market is really just you and I and our neighbors living in society without institutionalized violence, rules without rulers. Anarcho-communists might claim they give you the right to own yourself, but they are willing to gang up on you and take back the collective's property. At least an individualist who defends his justly acquired property has a valid claim. But why should 30 men get to tyrannize another peaceful individual? Just because the other 30 people said so? Very few people would ever enter into anarcho-communist arrangements because it is predestined to fail, as the individuals in the group would inevitably seek their own goals versus the goals of the centrally planned collective. The hypocrisy that the collective can own property, but that the individual can't. The fact that they ignore division of labor and scarcity. The fact that they would abolish all currency, even voluntary currency, which is really just a peaceful medium of exchange for feedback mechanisms. The fact that they view you as just some serf to the collective indicates that anarcho-communists haven't come far enough in their moral compass, and that they have repeatedly ignored history. Philosophically, anarcho-communism is an all-out assault on individuality and on rationality. The individual's desire to better him or herself, to avoid the tragedy of the commons, to partake in the voluntary pricing system, to specialize, to advance, to grow. All of these viewed negatively in the communes of anarcho-communism. You are looked down upon for growing and learning and working faster and harder than your peers. It actually stunts human development. Whether anarcho-communism is voluntary-based or coercive-backed, the hatred for the individual is ever prevalent. Where is the limit? Does this collective get to vote on my marriage? That is not freedom nor voluntarism, unless I subscribe to these terms in the first place. But don't expect me to subscribe to this rabid hatred of the individual called anarcho-communism anytime soon. Although you are certainly free to enjoy this inefficient central planning masochism as much as you'd like. I certainly won't infringe on you. I just ask you grant everyone else, including me, the same respect.